In a dry farming village where every drop of water meant survival, there was one woman people loved to gossip about. Her name was Martha Hale. She lived alone on a neglected piece of land at the far edge of the valley, a rocky farm most people considered useless. The fences were old, the grass was thin, and the farmhouse leaned slightly to one side after years of storms and neglect. Most people believed Martha's farm was already finished. The soil had hardened from years of drought. Her small pond had dried up months earlier. The old well near the barn barely gave a trickle. And her crops had failed 2 seasons in a row, so when Martha sold nearly everything she had left and used the money to buy 200 goats, the village laughed. Not quietly, not behind closed doors. They laughed right to her face. 200 goats? One farmer said, shaking his head. On that dead farm? She's lost her mind, another muttered. She can't even water her own garden, and now she wants to raise a herd? The jokes spread fast. At the grain store, at church, at the roadside market. Everywhere people talked about Martha and her goats. Some said she was desperate. Others said she was stubborn. A few said she was simply delaying the inevitable, because in their minds, there was only one ending to this story. The goats would eat what little remained on the land. The water would run out completely, and Martha would be forced to sell the farm for whatever she could get. But Martha ignored them. She had heard worse before. Every morning before sunrise, she was already outside feeding the herd, repairing fences, checking hooves, hauling buckets, and walking the perimeter of the land with dust on her boots and sweat on her brow. The goats followed her everywhere. They climbed broken stone walls. They squeezed under fence rails. They nibbled weeds most animals wouldn't touch. They wandered into thorny patches and scrubby corners no cow would ever bother with, and Martha watched them closely. Because unlike the villagers, she didn't buy the goats just for milk or meat. She bought them because goats were survivors. They could eat rough brush, live on harsh land, and move through terrain that other livestock avoided. Martha had spent months studying how dryland farmers in other regions used goats to restore overgrown land, clear invasive plants, and uncover hidden paths through rough ground. She had a theory, not a guarantee, just a theory. Her grandfather used to tell stories about the valley before the drought years. He spoke of old underground streams, buried springs, and patches of land where the grass stayed green even in the hottest summers. Most people dismissed those stories as old farmer talk, but Martha remembered every word. And one detail had stayed with her since childhood. Her grandfather once said that animals often sense water before humans ever do. At the time, Martha thought it was just another country saying. But now, with her farm dying and her options running out, she clung to it like a final thread of hope. So she watched the goats, day after day, week after week. At first, nothing happened. The herd spread out across the property as expected, chewing through weeds and dry brush. They stripped thorn bushes bare, climbed over rocks, and wandered across every corner of the land. But then Martha noticed something strange. No matter where she led them in the morning, a small group of goats kept drifting back toward the same rocky patch on the far side of the farm. It wasn't a useful part of the property. There was no shade there, no visible water, no fresh grass. Just cracked ground, loose stones, and a cluster of stubborn brush growing between jagged rocks. At first, Martha assumed it meant nothing, but the goats kept returning. Not one day, not 2 days, every day, even after feeding, even in the afternoon heat. They'd wander there, sniff the ground, paw at the dirt, and linger longer than they did anywhere else on the farm. Martha began paying closer attention. One morning, she followed them before sunrise and stood quietly behind a rusted fence post while the herd spread across the field. Sure enough, a dozen of the goats made their way straight to the rocky patch. One large white doe stepped onto a flat stone and began pawing at the earth beside. Another lowered its head and sniffed between the cracks. Then a third goat started licking damp-looking mud clinging to the base of the rocks. Martha froze. Damp mud? That made no sense. The entire farm had been bone dry for months. She knelt down and touched the soil. It was cool, not wet, but cooler than the surrounding ground, cool enough to make her heart race. That afternoon, Martha returned with a shovel. She dug for hours beneath the brush and stones while the sun burned overhead. The ground was hard and stubborn. Her shoulders ached. Her palms blistered. Twice she nearly gave up. But just before sunset, her shovel struck something unusual. Not rock, not roots, wood. Martha dropped to her knees and cleared away the dirt with her hands. Buried beneath the soil was a rotting wooden board, old, dark, and brittle with age. It looked man-made, as if it had once covered something below. Her pulse quickened. She worked until the light faded, uncovering more of the wood and the stone edges around it. By the time darkness fell, Martha could see the shape of a collapsed stone opening, half hidden under decades of dirt and brush. It wasn't a natural crack in the earth. It looked like the top of an old spring box, or perhaps the remains of a hand-built water access point. Martha barely slept that night. At dawn, she returned with tools, a lantern, and one of the only people in the village who still spoke to her kindly, an older widower named Ben Carter, who lived 2 farms over. Ben had heard the gossip about the goats like everyone else, but unlike the others, he never mocked Martha. He simply tipped his hat and minded his business. When Martha showed him the buried structure, his expression changed immediately. "I'll be damned," he whispered. Together, they spent the day clearing away rocks, roots, and collapsed boards. As the opening widened, they found old hand-laid stones stacked in a square formation beneath the dirt. Ben crouched beside it and ran his fingers across the stone. "This is old," he said. "Very old." "How old?" Martha asked. "Old enough that whoever built it is long gone." They cleared another layer of mud. Then Ben stopped and leaned closer. "Do you hear that?" Martha held her breath. At first she heard nothing. Then faintly, a sound. Soft, rhythmic, hidden. Water. Not much, but enough. Martha and Ben stared at each other in silence. There was water under the farm, hidden beneath the rocky patch the goats kept returning to. Word should have stayed quiet, but in small farming communities, nothing stays quiet for long. By the next afternoon, 3 neighbors had shown up just to take a look. By evening, there were 10, and by the following morning, nearly half the village knew Martha had found something beneath the rocky corner of her land. At first, nobody believed it. The same people who laughed at her goats now stood around the half-cleared stone opening with folded arms and skeptical faces. One man peered down and snorted, probably just runoff trapped in an old pit. Another shook his head. "Even if there's water, it won't last." But Martha didn't argue. She kept digging. Ben stayed to help, and on the 3rd day, they finally broke through the collapsed stone lining at the bottom of the opening. A gush of cold water burst through the mud. Not a trickle, not a seep. A steady, clear flow surged into the pit, swirling around their boots before spilling into the shallow trench they dug beside it. Martha stumbled back in shock. Ben let out a laugh so loud it echoed across the field, and the neighbors watching from above went completely silent. Because suddenly, the joke wasn't funny anymore. The hidden water source was real. The goats had led Martha straight to it. For the next several days, everything changed. Men who had mocked her arrived offering tools. Teenagers came with buckets and shovels. Even the women who had whispered about Martha at the market showed up carrying food and cloth to help clean the spring site. Together, they cleared the old stone spring box, reinforced the walls, and built a simple channel to guide the water into storage tanks and troughs. The water was cold, clean, and constant. Nobody could explain how it had remained hidden for so long. Some of the older villagers said the spring may have been part of an old water system used generations earlier, before drought and erosion buried it. Others claimed the original owners of the valley probably covered it during a land dispute decades ago and never returned. Ben had a simpler theory. "Doesn't matter who hid it," he said. "What matters is that Martha found it." And he was right. Within weeks, Martha's farm looked different. The goats now had fresh water every day. Her dead garden patch was replanted. She seeded grass near the troughs. The orchard she thought was lost began showing signs of life again. Even the old pond, once dry and cracked, slowly began filling from redirected overflow. People driving past the farm slowed down to stare. Where there had been dust, there was green. Where there had been failure, there was movement. Where there had been ridicule, there was now something the village hadn't expected: respect. But the biggest surprise came later. Because Martha didn't keep the spring to herself. The drought was still hurting everyone in the valley. Neighboring farms were rationing water. Cattle were being sold early. Wells were dropping lower every week. Martha knew exactly what it felt like to stand on failing land and wonder if everything was about to disappear. So she made a decision that stunned the entire village. She allowed nearby farmers to draw water from the spring, carefully, fairly, and on a schedule Ben helped organize. Not enough to waste, not enough to drain it, but enough to help keep animals alive and small crops standing through the worst of the dry spell. The same neighbors who once laughed at her now lined up at her farm with tanks, barrels, and humbled expressions. Some apologized. Some couldn't even meet her eyes. One man removed his cap and said, "I was wrong about you, Martha." Another quietly admitted, "I thought those goats would ruin you." Martha simply nodded and kept working, because by then, she understood something the village had not. The goats were never the mistake. They were the reason she found the spring in the first place. They noticed what people ignored. They kept returning to what looked like useless ground. They trusted instinct where humans trusted appearances. And in doing so, they uncovered the very thing that saved the farm. By the end of summer, Martha's property had become one of the healthiest in the valley. The goats thrived. The garden expanded. The pasture slowly recovered. She began selling goat milk, cheese, and breeding stock. Visitors from nearby counties came to see the farm and hear the story for themselves. Not the story of a woman who got lucky, a woman who trusted observation over gossip, patience over panic, and work over pride. As for the villagers, they never forgot the lesson. Years later, people still talked about the season Martha Hale bought 200 goats, and everyone laughed. They remembered how they mocked her, how they called her desperate, how they swore she was making the final mistake of her life. And they remembered the silence that followed when cold water burst from the earth beneath her farm. Some stories in farming communities fade with time. This one didn't, because it became more than gossip. It became a warning, a reminder that the person everyone underestimates may be the one paying the closest attention. That old land still carries secrets, that survival sometimes looks foolish before it looks brilliant, and that sometimes the difference between ruin and rescue is hidden in the place nobody bothers to look. As the seasons passed, the rocky patch where the spring was found became the heart of Martha's farm. Wildflowers began growing around the stones. The troughs stayed full. The goats still wandered there each morning, climbing the rocks and sniffing the cool ground as if they knew exactly what they had done. Sometimes Martha would stand beside the spring at sunrise, listening to the sound of water moving beneath the stones. She'd think about the laughter, the whispers, the pity in people's eyes. And then she'd look across the land, green pasture, healthy goats, full tanks, growing crops, and smile. Because the farm they thought was dying had become the one that kept others alive, and the woman they mocked had become the one everyone turned to when the drought got bad. All because 200 goats kept returning to a patch of ground nobody else believed in. So the next time someone laughs at a farmer's strange idea, the next time a piece of land looks too far gone to save, the next time everyone agrees something is hopeless, they might want to remember Martha Hale, the woman with 200 goats, the woman the village laughed at, the woman who found water hidden beneath the farm and changed everything.